Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to simplify square roots. So before we begin, suppose that I start with the number 3. And then let's suppose that for whatever reason, I want to square 3. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that I'm going to be multiplying 3 by itself. So what if I now want to take what I have and get back to plain old 3 again? Well, that's really where square root comes in handy. So what the square root does is if I take the square root of something like 3 times 3, what that's telling me to do is that for every 2 factors of a particular number, the square root keeps one of those factors. So in this case, I would be left with just 3. So essentially, square root undoes squaring. So let's look at another example of just simplifying a square root. So imagine I have something like x times x times x times x times y times y times y. So what I'm looking for is basically 2 factors of each type, because what I know is that for every 2 factors, I can pull 1 factor out. So if we look at the example we have, let's start with the x's. So notice I've got 1 group of 2 x's, 2 groups of 2 x's. What that means when I'm simplifying the square root is that I can pull out 2 factors of x. So I can pull out an x squared. If we look at our y's, well, I've got 1 group of 2 y's, and then I have this 1 y left over. So what that means is this group of 2 y's allows me to pull 1 y out, and then I still have 1 y that's stuck underneath my square root. I can't really do anything with it because it doesn't have a partner. Let's look at one more example, and then we'll take a look at the original problem. So imagine this time I have the square root of 3 times 3 times 5 times x times x times x. Well, this time I've thrown numbers in, but the simplification process is no different. So when we look at our 3's, notice I've got 2 factors of 3, and since I'm doing square root, for every 2 factors I can pull 1 out, so I can pull a 3 out. The 5, unfortunately, I'm stuck with, because 5 doesn't have a partner, so I can't pull out a 5. When we look at our x's, well, notice I can make a group of 2, and then I've got 1 x left over. So with my group of 2 x's, I can pull 1 x out, and then I still have stuff left underneath my square root, and that stuff in this case is going to be this 5 here and this x here. So I'm going to be left with a 5x underneath my square root. So now let's go back and take a look at the original problem. So originally we had this guy. So my first step in simplifying a square root is I always want to factor both the number and then also the variable parts as much as possible. So if we start with the number, I've got 25. So if I factor 25, I get 5 times 5. And then y to the 6th is really just y times y times y times y times y times y. So then step 2 is to rewrite and simplify. So originally we had the square root of 25y to the 6th, and what we found was that 25 factors into 5 times 5, and then y to the 6th is just y times y times y times y times y times y. Now what I know from the background section is that for every 2 factors, I can pull 1 out. So let's look at the 5's first. So notice I can make a group of 2 5's, which means I can pull a 5 out. How many groups of 2 can I make with my y factors? Well, let's find out. So I've got 1 group of 2, 2 groups of 2, 3 groups of 2, which means I can pull out 3 factors of y. This time, I don't really have any leftover factors underneath my square root. I've used up all my factors when I pulled stuff out. So my final answer in this case is actually what I've written here. Since there's nothing left over under the square root, that's it. Alright, so I'd like you to try this one as an example. Pause the video and then restart after you've given it a try. Okay, so if we do our first step, if we factor things out, we've got 12 is going to factor into, one way to factor 12 is 4 times 3. And then if we factor the 4 down, 2 times 2, we can't go any further with our factors. And then if we do our variable parts, I'm just going to do that all underneath our radical. So 12 is really 2 times 2 times 3. Then I've got x to the 5th. And then I've got y to the 4th. So here we go. For every 2 factors of any type, we can pull 1 out. That's what the square root is telling us to do. So the square root of 2 times 2, that means I can pull a 2 out, since I could make a group of 2 2's. With the 3's, I'm stuck because I only have 1 3. Let's look at our x's. So I've got 1 group of 2 x's, 2 groups of 2 x's, which means I can pull out an x squared. And then there's still an x left underneath. When we look at the y's, I can pull out, let's see, I can make 1 group of 2 y's, 2 groups of 2 y's. So I can pull out a y squared. And then this time I am left with stuff underneath. And the stuff underneath, it looks like is a 3 and an x. So that would be our final answer.